With the recent passing of the British monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, it was hard to escape the news. All the stories recounting her more than 70-year reign. One delightful anecdote that perhaps you caught as well was shared by Her Majesty's personal bodyguard, a man by the name of Dick Griffin. In a TV interview, Griffin recounted that one afternoon in the early 2000s, he and the Queen were taking a stroll in the rolling hills near the Scottish royal castle known as Balmoral, when an American tourist hiking through the countryside approached them and struck up a friendly conversation. According to Griffin, it was not unusual for the Queen to stop and say hello to hikers passing through. And apparently unaware to whom he was speaking, the tourist told the Queen about his lovely vacation so far in Britain, and then politely asked her where she lived. I'm not going to try and do her accent. Well, I live in London, but I've got a holiday home just on the other side of those hills, she replied. And how long have you been coming here? He asked. I've been coming here ever since I was a little girl, about 80 years ago. With rising excitement, the hiker responded, well, if you've been coming up here for 80 years, you must have met the Queen. Quick as a flash, she replied, I haven't, but Dick here meets her regularly. The hiker then turned to the bodyguard and asked him what the Queen was like in person. Without letting on, he simply said, oh, she can be very cantankerous at times, but she has a great sense of humor. Of course, the American tourist took his camera out, gave it to the Queen, and asked, would you mind taking a photo of us? Then they swapped places, and the bodyguard took a picture of the hiker with the lady he had just met. After they parted ways, the Queen turned to the bodyguard and said, I'd love to be a fly on the wall when he shows those photos to his friends in America. Throughout our high holy days, but especially on Rosh Hashanah, we're called to do something extremely difficult, especially in this day and age. Like the hiker in the rolling Scottish hills who didn't recognize a monarch when he came right in front of her, we are called to recognize God as a monarch, to imagine God as a sovereign, as a melech. I don't know about you, but after all these years, I still find it hard to do. When I think of monarchy, I think of the now late Queen Elizabeth, whose visage appeared on the coins of the realm where I grew up, and the new King Charles, whose face will soon be on the coins of the realm. And I think of the tabloid headlines about the latest exploits about this prince or that duke or duchess. And I think about King George on stage in Hamilton, spit singing, "You'll be back." How can we think about God as a monarch? We in 2022, especially in this country, where a war was literally waged to get rid of the monarchy. And if God wandered into our Sonnenschein family sanctuary, would we recognize them? Or would we be like the tourist? Well, most of us who struggle with faith in an unseen deity understand that God doesn't wander into a sanctuary, at least not literally. And most of us who struggle with faith recognize that the language we encounter in our prayer books is filled with metaphor. Today, we understand that the language we encounter in our prayer books represents our ancestors' millennia-long struggle to put into language a concept that largely defies human comprehension. Or as my rabbinical school theology teacher, Rabbi Rachel Adler, would say, the metaphoric language of our prayers in attempting to speak about God is an attempt to F the ineffable. So how might we today, on the eve of a new Jewish year, find a connection with a strange metaphor like that of kingship, monarchy, sovereignty? Or will we forever be like that tourist in the Scottish hills? Perhaps we can find insight by considering how our ancestors thought about kings. In ancient times, kings were powerful indeed. They had the power over life and death, justice, military service, the waging of war, and the levying of taxes. They had spies everywhere watching over their subjects. They could be ruthless and capricious. And some could be benevolent and even wise, at least some of the time. Since we are so disconnected from ideas about monarchy, do we have some models of leadership today that might replace the metaphor of king or queen? A president, perhaps? A dictator? A prime minister? Maybe a basketball star? Or the CEO of a social media company? I don't know about you, but I don't think any of those quite hit the spot just right. The prayers we read at this season and throughout the year have been lovingly handed down and shaped by generations of our spiritual ancestors. Simply the act of carrying on the tradition has a power to connect us with the Eternal One. But perhaps there are other ways that we can be touched in our souls by imagining an aspect of God as being imbued with sovereignty. On this Erev Rosh Hashanah, I'd like to propose some ways we might be able to do just that. One way is that imagining God as our monarch can invite us to cultivate the internal quality of humility. These days are known as Yomim Noraim, the days of awe. And especially at this time of year, we are called to remember that we are not, in fact, at the center of the universe, however much we may think we are. We are called to recognize that there is a higher power, something much greater than ourselves. We may be powerful, at least sometimes, but we also know that we are powerless against so many things that are beyond our control. Another way to get our hearts and souls around imagining God as a monarch is to reflect on how such an image might give us a much-needed injection of chizuk, of strength. In the face of the challenges we encounter, we can be held up by the thought of Melech, Ozer, Umoshia, Umagen, a sovereign, a power that helps us, protects us, and saves us. When we feel alone and afraid, there can be an Avinu Malkeinu, a compassionate presence that can lift us up from the depths and bring light to our darkest moments. Through powerful teachings and traditions, through the loving hands and hearts of those around us, through the presence of friends, family, of community. Finally, imagining God as a monarch can inspire each of us to action. When we recite the Motzi over bread, we invoke Melech HaOlam, the sovereign of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. Yet we know that bread does not grow directly from the soil. It requires instead cultivation, harvesting. The wheat must be ground into flour, then kneaded and baked into the final product. Our heavenly monarch, as it were, wants us to be partners, to be a mamlechet kohanim, a kingdom of priests, an or legoyim, a light unto the nations, to lift up the fallen, to visit the sick, to pursue justice, to make peace when there is strife. In a midrash, an ancient rabbinic legend, the sages contrast the heavenly king from kings of flesh and blood. They observe that while earthly monarchs might mint coins with their image on each and every one, only God mints coins where the face on each one is unique. We are the coin of the realm. Each human being created, B'Tselem Elohim, reflects an image of God. And so, if we want to recognize God as Melech, as sovereign here in our sanctuary, or anywhere we go, all we need to do is look into the eyes of another human being. Another story that struck me about the now late Queen Elizabeth was the fact that whenever she was at her home in Balmoral, she would awaken through the playing under her window in the garden of bagpipes. On Rosh Hashanah, we do not hear the sound of bagpipes, but we will hear and have heard the sound of the shofar, rousing us from our spiritual slumber. In our morning service tomorrow, the shofar service itself will begin by proclaiming Malchuyot, God's sovereignty. Perhaps if we listen hard enough, the haunting sounds of the shofar might just pierce our hubris, remind us to be more humble. If we listen hard enough, perhaps the shofar will remind us of the possibility of being strengthened and surrounded by protection and by love. And if we listen hard enough, the haunting sounds of the shofar might just call us to redouble our efforts to be partners with Melech Malchei Hamlachim, the sovereign of all sovereigns, so that wherever we find ourselves, here in the synagogues, or in the hills of Scotland, when we encounter other people, we will always recognize the divine monarch that dwells forever in our midst. Amen.